Welcome to DeFi by Design, where we talk all things blockchain and cryptocurrency while striving to educate, empower, and enrich.
It's your boy Andy, and welcome back to the DeFi Slate YouTube channel. Smash the like button on this video, that really helps us out, and sit back and enjoy the content. Thank you very much.
What's going on, guys? Welcome back to episode 88 of the DeFi by Design podcast. Here today is 𝗵𝗵𝗴𝗵 Day. Now, the day that you're actually hearing this will have been passed, but we are on the edge of our seats as we rise another interest rate hike, and I'm looking forward to the days of crypto where what the central banks of the world don't have that big of an influence anymore. But we're back in the DeFi world. We're talking to a DeFi OG today, Roscoe from Revoke Cash. I remember the good old times during DeFi summer when I would go and farm yams and every other yam clone, and then find some hack on Twitter or some exploit from some guy and be like, oh man, gotta go and revoke all my accesses. So we're gonna talk today a lot about DeFi security, safety, risk management, some of Roscoe's outlook for the state of DeFi, Ethereum, kind of what's going on. And so, yeah, strap in. This will be a good one if you're kind of new to the risk management world, or if you want to shape up on your practices. So here today with Rob as well. Cheers, Rob. How you doing?
Good morning. Doing well. Yeah, happy 𝗵𝗵𝗴𝗵 Day. Probably another interest rate hike. Nothing we haven't seen before. So all is well in macro and crypto worlds. I'm stoked to talk to Roscoe because it's important. Like it's not something we talk about every day. Where we cover, kind of like the calmer kind of like the stuff that is necessary but not talked about too much. So we're going to talk about some of the security practices and some of the risk management practices here today. And yeah, Andy, like you said, Roscoe's an OG. I'm stoked to cover his thoughts on kind of the evolving world of crypto as we see it today. So Roscoe, how you doing, man?
Hey, nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me on.
Yeah, for sure. How did you jump into DeFi and come up with this idea?
Yeah, it's been a while now. So I've been involved in like crypto on the development side since early 2018, somewhere around that. Made my first like crypto investments during like the bull run of 2017. And then I guess when I lost all of that, you have to go in it for the tech. So that's when I got into development. Just kidding. But yeah, so then I've worked on a few different projects. And then at some point, I think 2019, we were at DEF CON in Osaka in Japan. And by then, like DeFi, or like modern DeFi didn't exist, of course, but like there were things like Uniswap and like it was definitely developing. And one of these things that that these emerging DeFi platforms had was, you have to grant allowances to your tokens. So if you want to swap DAI for ETH on Uniswap, you have to like give permission to Uniswap to take those tokens from your account and then give you new tokens, of course. And I remember I was talking to 𝗵𝗵𝗶𝗵𝗵 from 𝗵𝗵𝗂 at DEF CON, and actually one of the early versions of 𝗵𝗵𝗂, which is like a money streaming service for those who don't know it. One of the early beta versions had like a bug where test users actually lost some money. Well, of course, they were repaid from the smart contracts because it was like they didn't actually lose it. But that is sort of where Paul noticed the real world danger of these allowances, because these funds were lost because of allowances, and sort of the thing there is that like if you deposit funds into some application, you kind of know these funds, they might be at risk, right? I give this to like some DeFi thing. Well, maybe I'm not going to see them ever again. But for the funds that are in your wallet, you don't really maybe understand the risk that they face. So basically, after that, that kind of clicked with me as well, and I figured, okay, well, we need to have a way to mitigate those risks, sort of linked to allowances, and that is where Revoke.Cash was born. And then over the years that followed, essentially, it was expanded, new chains were added, new functionality was added, and here we are today.
Yeah. So when you allow a token allowance for, let's say like Aave coin in your wallet, and you deposit, 10 Aave of your 20 Aave coins into some protocol, right? There's a chance that by allowing them to access your Aave tokens, those other 10 that are still in your wallet could technically be drained, if I'm not mistaken. However, if you only allow token allowance for Aave, there's the other tokens in your wallet can't be drained. Is that correct? Does that kind of statement work?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So allowances are really on a sort of per token basis. So there's actually no way to give an allowance for all your tokens at the same time. So you have to do like one allowance for your DAI, one allowance for your Aave tokens, etc.
And would you say that having a hardware wallet would defend against a lot of like allowance attacks? Because if I had, let's say in this example, I deposited 10 Aave, then I still had 10 on my wallet, like let's call it a MetaMask, but I've got my treasure or my ledger connected. I would then still have to go and approve that second transaction, right? If they were trying to drain more, or no?
Actually, no, because essentially what you do is you sort of tell the DAI token, like, hey, if this protocol, let's say if Uniswap asks you for my money, they can take it, like without me needing to do anything for that. So, of course, hardware wallets definitely offer more protection for certain use cases than like a hot wallet. Like, that your seed phrase, like your private keys, are safe on the device. But in the case of these allowance type scams, they actually don't need your private keys because you're actually telling the smart contract, like, hey, it's okay if this person wants my money, give it to them if they ask.
Yeah. So we saw a lot of instances where people lost ETH because they approved ETH and they had a bunch in their wallet or wrapped ETH.
Yeah.
How common is it for protocols to request a permission for all of the tokens in the wallet rather than just a few that you're intending on swapping?
Yeah, very common, I would say. There was a while where sort of people were moving towards like sort of the just enough allowances. I think maybe in like 2020, but then at some point, as we've experienced, like gas fees started to rise, and that's kind of when these platforms stopped moving towards that and went back to sort of these unlimited allowances. And the reason for that is if you do like an allowance that is just enough, then every time you want to swap these tokens, for example, you would have to approve another allowance, which I think at the height of gas fees was like another $20-$30 added just to like approve one of these allowances. So when that's the case, there's definitely something like a case to be made for these unlimited allowances. So it's really a trade-off between like the convenience and the lower cost of unlimited allowances versus the safety of these like just enough allowances.
Was there a particular incident or event that caused you to create Revoke Cash? Were you like a victim of an allowance attack, or did you just kind of see this as like an important thing to create in the industry?
Yeah, I guess more of the second, and of course, a big part of the inspiration was sort of that whole like chatting with Paul Berg in Osaka, but like at that time in like the end of 2019, there hadn't really been any big allowance exploits. Like maybe here and there, someone lost some money, but nothing really high profile. So initially, like a lot of people weren't really aware of the issue. So a big part of it has also been just sort of like educating people on that. But then in 2020, like after DeFi summer and when a lot of DeFi really took off, that is when people really sort of realized, when a lot of people realized at least, like the risks that these allowances can have. And then it was good that Revoke.Cash already existed, because having to develop something in sort of the heat of the moment is never ideal, of course.
Yeah, I remember, like I said, clearly, like Yam's time and all the other forks. So right now there are still protocols that exist where you have to allow access to your entire wallet versus token. What does that look like from a user's perspective? Like how can a user know, like on MetaMask, on Uniswap, you go approve access to USDC to swap or something, right? But is there a separate approval kind of confirmation pop up on MetaMask that they're able to tell and differentiate, when you're doing a full token approval versus just in a one?
Well, so in like the MetaMask interface, for example, when you get this pop-up for a token approval, there's always like another tab. I'm not entirely sure like what the title of the tab is right now, but you can like inspect exactly what you're doing, and you can also edit that like inside your MetaMask pop-up. And just to reiterate, like an allowance is always for like one specific type of token, like DAI, but then it can be like either a low amount or an unlimited amount. But so even if like protocols like Uniswap, for example, don't offer a native, like a button for you to just approve a tiny bit of tokens, like just enough, you can also set that yourself in the MetaMask pop-up. And it's like with a lot of MetaMask interfaces, it's not the most user-friendly or the most understandable to update that. But if you read up on it a bit, then that's definitely a good option.
Yeah. It's weird. I feel like I've only seen single token, but now that you mention it, it makes me kind of think of all the ones out there. So a simple way to kind of see which protocols you've interacted with and which protocols have access to your funds is to kind of go on Revoke.Cash, and you can see every single protocol that you've interacted with, and then you can basically revoke access to the funds. So what does that transaction look like on like a tech side? It's basically, is it like a reversion of the initial, or kind of what does that look like?
All right. So yeah, like for like when you're setting an approval for a token, when you're setting an allowance, you have to like that transaction. You have to provide like who you're approving and then how much you're approving. So you're basically like if you're approving Uniswap, then for example you send to like the DAI smart contract. You say, hey DAI bank, this address that belongs to Uniswap can take up to 1,000 of my DAI or 10,000 or something like that. And then sort of when you want to revoke that, you do the exact same thing, but you say 0. So you say, hey, if Uniswap asks for my money, I will allow up to 0 DAI to be taken. And that's like that corresponds to like revoking it. But technically they are the exact same thing. So either you're saying I am approving up to 10,000 or up to 0. Just one of them we call revoking and the other we call approving.
How like frequently do you suggest DeFi power users revoke their permissions?
Right, that's a good question. I actually posted a thread on the or tweet on the Revoke.Cash Twitter today about Revoke Wednesday. So we're trying to push this new initiative that, you know, every Wednesday you should be checking your allowances. And like, if you're a very heavy user, then maybe you should check it more often. And if you like rarely use crypto really, then of course you don't have to keep checking if you didn't do anything. But I think as a rule of thumb, just every week is a pretty good interval to just check like, hey, what have I been up to? And so yeah, Revoke Wednesday. Nice.
Yeah, we can definitely get in that healthy routine there. And on Revoke Cash, okay, so actually taking a step back, on MetaMask, there's the option to see your connected sites, right? And that isn't necessarily what has permission to access your tokens. That's just the decentralized applications that a user has connected their wallet to. Does Revoke Cash, when you're looking at like, okay, what have you been up to over the last week, does it tell you what sites you've connected to? Or does it tell you like even more in depth, like, okay, this is what still has permission to access some of your tokens?
Right. Yeah. So actually, yeah, like you also mentioned, like there are two very different things. And in one case, the connected apps or the connected websites in your MetaMask, that is like a MetaMask specific thing. And what that means is that all these websites, if you go to that website, then they can see your wallet address. But that is not something that has like, that's not on-chain, that doesn't really have anything to do with like the blockchain or like smart contracts in general. So also when you go to Revoke.Cash, there's no way for the Revoke.Cash website to know like which websites you're connected to on MetaMask. And so the only thing that we can really tell you, which is sort of the more important thing, is like you said, you know, who still has access to your tokens. And yeah, so from that point of view, it doesn't really matter who can see your address, because if I can see your address, that doesn't really mean anything for security purposes. But if I have the permission to take your money, then that does obviously have a much bigger impact.
Right. And some of these approvals are with protocols that have a decentralized way of basically controlling the protocol, in that even if there was one person on the team who's trying to, steal a bunch of user funds, they really couldn't. But the main issue here is that there's some, and that we've seen in the past, and this is why it's very important that we have some of these sleuths on chain who check things like admin key and master lock and things like this, because there's some protocols you connect to that with just a couple clicks and a very easy either a multi-sig or just a single wallet can basically drain all the users' wallets that have approved. So I know that we've seen a few of these in the past, and definitely have saved quite a few people with Revoke.Cash. But there's also something to be said kind of about the design of smart contracts when it comes to these protocols. Yeah, I mean, I guess like, again, on a technical level, like, is there something that users can, if they choose to dig into the code or can just like a few key identifiers for protocols, that are kind of sketchy? Like, is there anything that comes to the top of your mind?
Yeah, I think when you're really like looking at the smart contract code, I think one of the biggest things to look out for is like upgradability of smart contracts. Because if a smart contract is upgradable, then it doesn't really matter what the current version of the smart contract logic is, because they might as well change that logic to something completely different tomorrow. And then of course not every upgradable contract is the same. As you also mentioned, like sometimes the admin is just one single account, which is a lot worse than an admin being like a multi-sig, for example. But in general, like like, for example, if you're looking at your allowances, like which ones should you revoke and which ones, you know, might be fine. Like, for example, if you're looking at Uniswap, those are non-upgradable contracts that have been around for quite a long time, that have been audited, that have been like thoroughly reviewed. So something like that, and like similar platforms, that's probably fine if you have allowances to those platforms. But then, yeah, if as soon as something is upgradable, yeah, you just don't know.
What has it been like developing and like founding Revoke Cash? Like, there isn't a clear like monetization strategy or something with Revoke Cash. Like, are you guys VC backed? Like, what's kind of the like what is it like? You know, building a decentralized application that is almost like a public good to the infrastructure of DeFi.
Right. Yeah. So initially, Revoke Cash was just like a side project that I hacked up in a couple of days, just sort of to solve this issue of like, you know, we have a bunch of approvals and we don't know what to do with them. And for a long time, that was just kind of what it was. And, you know, every now and then I would write a little bit of code on that, and and it would grow slowly but steadily. But then as crypto grew, we saw that there's like a lot more like a lot more people started using Revoke, and, you know, there were a lot of feature requests like, oh, can you support this chain? Can you support that chain? Can you support other new functionalities? So at some point it was sort of starting, it was a bit too big to be like a side project, right? So that is when I decided to just go full on this. And as it is today, so Revoke Cash is a one-man army. That's me. But it's no longer a side project. So it is just me manning the ship, and you know, I get some help here and there, and I have like for some things I get like freelance help. But overall, you know, it just being me means that you know, there's not a super high burn rate, and it means that that the application can do things in a sort of in a sustainable way. And yeah, so development has been funded through like things like Gitcoin grants and donations, and until now that has been enough to sort of fund my development of it. But I have been thinking more about like, hey, how can this be sort of more of a business, rather than sort of, like, I mean, rather than like more of a project. And it's kind of an interesting dilemma, like being in sort of the security space, because sort of these security tools should be accessible to people, because, you know, people are losing money to scams and to like bugs, hacks, whatever. And you just want to make sure that you can help as many people as possible to not get scammed. But then at the same time, you also like need to be sustainable. You need to make money. So yeah, I've been sort of trying to come up with like certain features and functionality that would be sort of like nice to have that you could pay for, but that wouldn't really impact regular users' ability to keep themselves safe. And so that is sort of the short-term roadmap in like the coming, let's say, 3 months. The idea is to just have like some tiny added features that people can like pay a tiny subscription for, and see if that can be enough to sort of make up for, like, in addition to sort of the donations and the grants that we get, to sort of maybe expand the company as well, and see how that goes.
Nice. Yeah, go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, that's very cool. Is there a vision? Like, what are some of the added features, that you have that are kind of like nice to haves, and you're kind of like forecasting, as new features to implement onto the application?
Right. Yeah, I think one of the big ones is sort of like more bulk operations. So, checking a bunch of addresses at the same time on a bunch of chains at the same time, because those are not necessarily things that are prohibitive to sort of the free users, but if you but they can be a big time saver, which I think makes it sort of a good candidate for a paid feature. Because everyone can still access all the same functionality. Just some people can do it a bit faster.
Cool.
And then at the same time, there's also there's still a lot of things that can be expanded for like the free version as well, for everybody, because I think still like almost everything about Revoke Cash should be free. So other things that we're thinking of, or that I'm thinking of, is like better education, so more of like a knowledge base for people to sort of understand what like DeFi security and what like crypto security means. There is also the Revoke.Cash browser extension that was released a couple of months ago, which essentially acts as like a middleman between the application that you're interacting with and your wallet, like your MetaMask. And anytime you do something that might be potentially harmful, like approving an allowance or like listing NFTs for sale, then you get a pop-up from the Revoke.Cash browser extension, and it just tells you, hey, this is what you're about to do. Are you sure that's what you want to do? And then it's up to the user to say yes or no to that. And like if you're a user and for example, you're trying to swap tokens, you're trying to swap your DAI for ETH, then it makes sense that you have to set an allowance for DAI. But if you're trying to mint an NFT and then you see this pop-up saying, oh, do you want to approve an allowance for all your Bored Apes? Then it should also be pretty clear to you that that's not your intention. So that's kind of the idea there, and it's been cool to see the growth of that as well, and the stories of people on Twitter as well, that it has already like saved plenty of people from like phishing scams just before they happen, because Revoke.Cash, as it is right now, it's sort of like two-sided. On one hand, you have sort of the maintenance side, where you're like, okay, well, check in every Wednesday or check in periodically. Like, hey, what are my allowances? Do I still need those or not? And then there's sort of like the sort of after the fact damage control, like, oh shit, I got scammed. I went to this phishing site. I clicked some stuff that I shouldn't have. What now? And then Revoke.Cash. Well, obviously it doesn't help you to get your assets back, because if it's stolen, it's stolen. But it does help sort of roll back those allowances so that you can just keep using your wallet as usual after you sort of like reset those allowances. But in that second case, it would be better if you wouldn't get scammed in the first place, and that is sort of where that browser extension came from. And yeah, that's so there's also still plenty of things there that can be done.
Yeah, it's definitely cool. All those browser extensions have been helpful. The gas and the Revoke Cash, and of course the wallets, and just kind of being able to get out in front of that issue before it comes up makes it even more appealing for users. It's almost like if we had something that would be like, stop, this is a scam, don't click this. Obviously, it's like easier said than done, but like, I mean, the amount of bored apes that would be saved from that, yeah, is just insane. Kind of flipping switches here into what we have now in DeFi. I'm curious what your general thoughts are on the DeFi ecosystem currently, and kind of what you see going forward. Feel free to be as optimistic or pessimistic or realistic as you like.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah. I think of course DeFi, or like the sort of DeFi hype, started in summer of 2020, or at least that's where it really kicked off. And I guess one of the innovations there was like the yield farming, like liquidity mining, those kinds of things. And that has sort of persisted for years, that sort of same paradigm. But what we saw in the summer of 2020, with the sort of token inflations going through the roof, like, okay, well, yeah, you have this sort of yield farming. You're getting this token to do a certain thing, to like provide liquidity, whatever. But then everybody's doing that just for the farming, and they're dumping the token. That whole dynamic has also still persisted for a lot of big projects, and it would probably be good for DeFi in general, like if more projects would be moving towards like more sustainable yields. So rather than like inflationary tokens, like if that yield can be found somewhere else. And of course, that's not a new idea either, because that's essentially what things like LP rewards for like Uniswap providers is. Like, okay, yeah, well, you have this tiny spread on the or like this tiny fee if you're providing liquidity, like the 0.30%. So things like that, and then it will be interesting to see if there's like ways to get higher than that 0.30%, but in a sort of sustainable way without printing new tokens. And I think one interesting protocol that has been doing that for a while is like NFTX, which is essentially like a sort of ERC20 wrapper for NFTs. So you can like deposit your NFT, and then you get like an ERC20 version of that, and you can and then they have like this big pool of NFTs that you can exchange your tokens for, again, like your ERC20 tokens. But then every time people do that, there's a fee. And that fee goes to like the people that are providing liquidity there. So that is essentially like you're providing liquidity on those NFTs, and on top of that, you are getting like more fees from NFTX, but those fees are generated like from actual usage of the products. And I think having more of that kind of dynamic is going to be really nice for DeFi, because at that point, like, it will just be more sustainable and hopefully like less like inflation powered, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. Better.
Yeah, the concept of real yield, like however it's formed, the most intuitive might be like lending and borrowing protocols where there is some interest paid to the lenders because the borrowers are using the product. They're, borrowing, and they're paying a fee in the form of interest to those lenders. And then similarly, like liquidity providers are lending their tokens or their liquidity in a sense to those who are swapping the tokens between like whatever market pair is in that liquidity pool. And it seems like it builds in complexity from there. Ultimately, like there's the real yield that accrues like back to the token holders, and it's kind of like paid as a fee to those liquidity providers or those lenders. And then is there, sometimes it seems like there's like token, there's cash accrual or like revenue accrual to the token itself. And maybe it just looks like a burn program. So like by using that token, by burning it, it's just another form of like taking that fee. And instead of redistributing it back to the token holders, it just kind of doesn't go anywhere. It just kind of impacts the token beneficially. Yeah, and I'm excited to see kind of like the different use cases, but I totally agree how there's like there's the concept of like fake yield and real yield, where like we can just print money out of thin air and recreate the system that like is already perpetuated in like the macro sense,
right?
But we're not really fixing anything. It's just printing fake inflationary tokens as yield, and then there's like the actual demand for the products that people are willing to pay for, which ultimately is like the real like cash flow or revenue that can accrue back to a project's token or back to their community.
Yeah. And what I found super interesting, Roscoe, as well, is that what Rob's saying, the demand for like users to borrow stable coins, for example, drives a lot of yield on the lending and borrowing protocols. And you would think that with all central banks raising rates, that there would be also an inherent raise in the rate of DeFi stablecoin borrowing. But that's not the case. It's actually inverse. It's like we see higher rates for stablecoins when people are speculating on assets going up and borrowing stablecoins to buy, which tends to actually happen in lower interest rates environments. So it's like we're kind of in a weird flip-flop where the rates are higher, people are speculating less, people have less capital, less desire to be crazy. So the stablecoin yields are much lower and the yields of DeFi are much lower, but the actual yields are much higher in the world that you can get. And then once that kind of flips and comes back, I anticipate the same thing. So it's kind of this weird like fix where it's almost like we had it backwards. Like right now is when we need token inflation to boost our yields. But then once the bull market kind of returns, we don't really need so much inflation because there's already just a lot of speculative activity. So I feel like yields were so juiced up because of the initial token inflation plus the fact that actual speculation was happening at such a high level. So it's just that interesting kind of like conundrum here of when do the yields return? And I think it's very much so of like when the speculative kind of desire returns.
I think it's indicative of why people are borrowing. Like people might deposit into a like a treasury bond or something for like that risk-free rate. And then people are borrowing money, in like the macroeconomic sense to start a business or, to kind of juice people aren't really borrowing in the macro economy to like leverage, but I think that's the primary reason people borrow, like DeFi power users borrow, which drives interest rates up. And it is an interesting balance. Roscoe, what do you think?
Yeah, it's actually super interesting. Yeah, I've never really thought about that sort of relationship between the real world yields and like on-chain yields, but it makes a lot of sense. Just like you said, a lot of the demand for stablecoins is for speculation and is for like leverage trading on like crypto. So in that sense, sort of the demand for stablecoins is not very different from just demand for crypto in general, which is super interesting because they are kind of like they are very similar, like very different assets than crypto. Like in sort of like what it is, they're much closer to just like real world USD than to like ETH, for example. Like if you're talking about USDC, but then the dynamics around it are much closer to ETH than to like real world USD. It's a very interesting dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I just wonder what will drive speculation back. And I mean, I don't know if we're ever going to get DeFi like it was, but I think NFTs are kind of like big and something definitely to pay attention for kind of just the future. I think those are definitely going to be kind of eaten up again in a more speculative nature. I mean, also just the ETH tokenomics, once we do get that activity back, and hopefully it's from DeFi, NFTs, DAOs, and everything, and gas is coming up, like that burn is going to be so ridiculous that, like, I mean, it's going to be so deflationary. It's not like it was so close on ultrasound.money, and then it's kind of poked its head back up now, which is kind of sad.
Yeah,
like it was getting super close, and now it's like a little further away. But man, like all we need is a something, man. We just need like a little spark, and that thing gets going, and it's just like, oh man, like the people will be talking about the deflationary nature of that for ages. So I'm looking forward to that, but I don't know if we're out of the woods yet, like necessarily price wise, but definitely, excited to see the future and stay safe with Revoke Cash, and just keep your head above water and don't get hacked.
That's always good advice.
Yeah, seriously. Kind of wrapping up here as we get on with our community. They can definitely get on Revoke Cash and access the product and the tool. Can join either Discord or join Twitter. How else can we get involved?
Definitely join our Discord channel. Follow Twitter. Use the product. There's also, of course, the quarterly Gitcoin grants rounds going on. So, if you're a user of the product and want to support like future development, make sure to contribute to that as well. I mean, spread the word. Stay safe.
Sweet. Thanks for coming on, Roscoe. It was a pleasure, man.
Cheers,
Yeah,
Roscoe.
it was good. Thanks, guys.